Madinah Institute for Leadership and Entrepreneurship, MILE.
Excellent. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be a part of the Madinah Institute for Leadership and Entrepreneurship as we talk about this whole subject of change. And as Mr. Jeffrey gave some of my background, so we won't spend a lot of time talking about that, to begin by saying that with my 20 years of experience in working with organizations and individuals on change and change management, it certainly is a topic that just never seems to go away. There's always more interest and more need for addressing change in the workplace, as we'll talk about as we go through the presentation today. First of all, a website to show you. I'm trying to get my screen to advance. I apologize. It is not advancing at this point, but we will figure out what's going on here shortly.
You might have the screen to move it forward. I think it's okay.
There we go. We got it. Yep, we're good. First of all, for some additional information, for those of you who may not be able to stay for the entire time or need some additional information related to the subject matter today, then you can go to joneslaughlin.com/mile. There's some additional resources there related to the webinar today. So I give you that as an opportunity to continue the learning once we're finished today. So let's get into the content. That's what you, of course, decide to participate in the webinar with, as we talk about this idea of change and change management. And certainly just seeing that word on the screen evokes a number of but there always seems to be this sense of urgency, but it's almost a negative sense of urgency about change. And anytime we are approached with the opportunity to do something different, we question that, especially if we're feeling pushed or forced. It can cause us not to want to change so that we can maintain our own work routines, keep doing things the same way we've always done them. And so there needs to be something different. There ought to be a different way of looking at change. And several years ago, I began focusing on some of my background, of all places, in horticulture and working with plants and working with plants in the landscape and gardening. I began to see a process that I thought could be a fresh way for individuals and organizations to approach change to get, number one, better results, but number two, to be a more positive process as they went through this change journey. And so as I dug into my research and looked for some different sources and to see what other people were saying, I think one of the most telling comments that I saw in my research was a quote by Peter Singh, who said, "When it comes to change, we keep bringing in mechanics when what we need are gardeners." Now think about that word mechanic for a moment in times of change. Why do you go to a mechanic? You go to a mechanic because something is broken. Something is not working well. And for me, as I think about mechanic, I think of an auto mechanic who's working on my automobile. He or she is going to fix what's broken, and then I'm going to leave there, and I'm not going to think a thing about that automobile or that mechanic or doing something differently with my automobile until something is probably broken again. Of course, I do maintenance, but I really don't think about that mechanic again until something goes wrong. Too often in times of change, organizations, and especially organization leaders, take this same approach where they show up or start initiatives when things are, quote, going wrong, or people aren't doing what they think they should be doing. And many times they're right. It's not that they're incorrect in their desire to see things get better. It's just that it's seen as, hey, something's broken, it's got to be fixed, and then everything will be okay. On the other hand, we start looking at the idea of a gardener. You think about a gardener, they're constantly working. Sure, there are seasons where they are working diligently to get the plants started, and of course during the harvest season things have to be done at certain times, but there's a process there that they begin to work through constantly, and they're always looking for the need or the opportunity to pull weeds or to improve the growth rate of something. So gardener brings to mind a much different mentality with the idea that we're gardening to get something, whether it's aesthetic beauty because it's a flower bed, or if it's growing something in a vegetable garden. It gives a different mindset and perspective to those involved in the change. And continuing on with Singh's comments, you get leaders who approach change as if they were growing something rather than just changing something. This builds on the whole idea, for those of you involved in change management and change management philosophies, the idea of appreciative inquiry. We're going to build on the strengths. A gardener starts from where they are and they grow something better. A mechanic starts with where things are broken and how to fix it. And so just the whole idea of being a more natural and more positive approach to change would seem to be much more inviting to those individuals who are going to experience the real change in this process. So we begin talking about and looking at this idea of growing change with the idea of planting. If we're going to grow anything, then we've got to plant it, whether it's seeds, whether it's a plant of some kind, whether it's a tree, doesn't matter. But we're going to put it in the ground or the soil for growth. And this is where I hope you'll begin to see that the universal nature and how applicable this analogy is to all levels within your organization, but individuals from around the world, especially for organizations that are global in nature, which is more and more each day, using some type of analogy that everyone can relate to. As Mr. Jaffrey said, my background is with Who Moved My Cheese, and one of the beautiful strengths of Who Moved My Cheese was around the world people could understand a maize, they could understand cheese, they could understand the four perspectives on change, and so those concepts could be applied wherever someone was located. I feel the same way about this approach, because regardless of what part of the world you're in, you understand growing something, and maybe not all the intricacies of that, but we'll talk more about that as we move through. So if we're going to plant something, the question for all of you to be thinking about right now is, if I'm going to plant something, I'm going to grow something, what does it need to be successful? So this change that I want to make, this organizational change that I want to be successful with, or this individual change that I want to be successful with, then what's it going to take for it to grow and to begin to take off, if you will? And so one of the first things it's going to need is going to need the right soil. It's going to need the right support system for it to begin to grow. And what we mean there is the culture surrounding that organizational change. What's that culture like? And of course, we could spend the rest of our webinar just talking about culture itself, but taking some time to identify, is there a culture around this organizational change that would seem to support it, or is the culture one that would be resistant? And what can I do, just like we would improve the soil to grow something better, what can I do to begin to move that culture in the right direction? And this may need to happen before you really begin moving forward with the change. It may need to happen very early on in the process, where you begin working with the culture. For example, if there's not a culture of allowing failure or accepting failure or encouraging failure, then if we're going to start a change process, we probably need to begin focusing more on how can we be more accepting of failure in the process, because we know there's going to be some trial and error. Anytime there's a change brought about, there's going to be some things that are going to work well, some things are going to work not so well. And so what does the culture support right now, and how can we begin moving that or changing that, perhaps along with the change? So that would be the first element that's needed. Now, the second one is priority. I often ask organizational leaders when working with them on a change, I'll say, now, what are you going to take off their plate so that they can make this change or the parts of this change process a priority? And they look at me rather funny, and they go, well, I don't know. And I'm reminded of that phrase, and I share that with them, that if everything is considered a priority, then nothing's a priority. Just like a plant has to have the sunlight to begin to grow and start that process of photosynthesis, this change initiative, these changes that you want to make within an organization have to become a priority. They have to be the first thing on the agenda, not the last thing on the agenda. They need to be the first thing that a manager talks about with their direct reports, not the last thing. But it's so easy when organizations are moving so quickly these days just to throw the change in with everything else and to hope it survives. As we can see from plants, that doesn't work well. Thirdly, as we talk about this whole idea of planting, is it's going to need resources. Any change requires resources, just as a plant requires water and nutrients to succeed. Are you going to give people time to think, to plan, to collaborate with their own department, with people from other departments? Are you going to give them time to work out processes to make this change successful? Because remember, they already have a full load of responsibilities that they're focusing on. So they're going to need some resources for this change to be successful. And so I think that's an important part of the planting process. And then the one that so many of us, including myself, forget in times of change, and that very simply is this idea of urgency. Of course, John Cotter's work is phenomenal on this idea of creating a shared sense of urgency in the organization. It's just so critical that people have a sense of urgency to change. And in fact, if they don't have a sense of urgency to change, then they're not going to probably engage in new actions or new behaviors, or even begin developing new perspectives or attitudes so that they can be successful with the change. And I think that comes down all the way in an organization to sometimes what creates a sense of urgency is if a manager who is well trusted by those in the organization, if that manager has a strong relationship with that individual, they can ask that individual to begin changing, to begin growing something differently, if you will. And they will, simply because they trust that manager. So there's all kinds of ways we can create urgency, but does that urgency exist? So the first word in those 4 words of successful change is plant. The second one is cultivate. And cultivate, very simply, means improving growth through conditions you can influence. Think of the idea of continuous improvement.
Sorry to interrupt you, but would it be possible to speak up a little bit, because some attendees are finding it difficult to hear you loud, so sorry to interrupt you.
Okay, does this seem to be better, Mr. Jaffrey?
Yeah, it's better now, I know. But,
okay.
No, you have to keep this momentum now. Thank you very much. Sorry.
Sure. But no, that's fine. That's fine. As we talk about this idea of cultivation, we're talking about continual improvement, constantly going back to the change, keeping it in the forefront as far as what we're doing. If you go back to the gardener, gardener would never plant something, walk away, and then come back 3 months later expecting to gain a harvest. They would consistently be out there examining, does it need water, does it need nutrients, how is it growing, how can we help it grow more effectively and efficiently. Even Jim Collins in the book Built to Last talks about this idea of continual improvement being ingrained into the fabric of the organization. That's the same process we're talking about with cultivating change, in that we are constantly checking on it, seeing how it's doing. How can we help it to grow more effectively? And I believe there are 3 key areas to look at when we talk about cultivating change. One of them very simply, we've already talked about to a degree, is this idea of priorities. What's going to shift so that people can make this change a priority. What maybe needs to be shortened, what needs to be less than you had planned on it being within an organization. Perhaps some product line, if it's a manufacturing type organization, perhaps some product line that we were going to produce X number of units for, we say, okay, how can we, can we shorten that in any way so that we could begin to try out this new product, or could we start up another line? But what are the priorities that are going to shift so you can cultivate, really encourage this change to be successful? The second P is processes. What are the systems and processes that need to be looked at so that this change has a good chance of being successful? And that's not only for the organization but for the individual. When I'm training individuals who are going through an organizational change, I take it all the way down to the point of what's going to be different about your daily routine. What's going to be different about the way you do your job every day, keeping in mind this change that you're engaged with right now? How will your planning be different? How will you go about your day different? That's so key, because one of the things that we find in organizational change is that we don't want to disrupt the daily routine any more than we have to for individuals who are going through the change. That causes productivity to go down the more we disrupt that daily routine. So if people up front can begin to identify how they're going to rearrange their day, how they're going to work differently, they can begin planning for that, and then it's not as disruptive to their workflow during the day. The third P, the first one's priorities, the second one's processes. You got it. I mean, very obviously, the third one's got to be people. How are we going to interact with people differently? How are we going to talk with people differently? What kinds of questions are we going to ask? Who do we need to request resources from? Who do we need to ask to give us feedback that we didn't before? Maybe there's some data that's needed for this change, and there's a certain individual who would have access to that data. But it's all about how we're going to work with people differently. So as you can see, once we look at shifting priorities, the processes, and the people, then we're cultivating that change now. We have literally made it a priority. We're ingraining that idea into our day so that we can continue to work, but with the mindset that we are growing something better for our organization and hopefully for ourselves as well. So we begin by planting. We continue with cultivating. The third word in this process is pruning. The idea that we've got to prune. Definition, as you see there, is cutting back to produce more fruitful growth. If we think about the idea of pruning for just a moment, then pruning is taking away parts of a plant that are non-productive, that aren't leading to the outcome we want. Very obviously, on a plant, we would prune those things that are dead or diseased or deformed. But in an organization or with individuals, it certainly wouldn't be those things. But where do we need to reallocate resources? We know that individuals in the workplace today are certainly some cases overwhelmed, but certainly their plate is full. They have multiple responsibilities. They have different individuals they're responding to. They have no room in their day as it currently sits many times to act differently related to a change, unless they reduce time spent on an assignment or a task or something else the organization has given them. Then they have the optimal time to focus on that change. So we begin this idea of pruning just to kind of get you in thinking about that. Here is an apple tree growing in North Carolina, the state from which I'm from here in the U.S. Beautiful apple tree. You can see the shape of this tree, just very elegant, if you will. But of course, the question for you, and that many of you are asking, is where are the apples? what's on this tree that would be something I could harvest? And the answer is there are very few things on this tree. There are a few small light green dots that you can see throughout the tree. And so my question to all of you, you can be a momentary horticulturalist, if you will, is what's wrong with this tree? And we've already identified one problem is that, well, it's just not producing the apples that we'd like to have. From a deeper perspective, though, what's wrong with this apple tree? And some of you say, well, it needs to be pruned. It's got too many limbs, going in too many different directions. And then some of you are maybe a little more advanced horticulturists, and you would say there's too much energy going to the limbs and leaves, and there's not enough going to produce apples. And let's remember, what's the key thing that we want an apple tree to do? We want it to produce apples. And so certainly this tree is not aligned correctly to do that because of the way it's growing and how it's not been pruned. How much is this like your organization? In that there are certain outcomes you're looking for, they've been identified clearly, but there's so much activity within the organization that there's no way that those outcomes could be grown, if you will, because there's too much energy being spent moving on this initiative, that initiative, looking in this direction, working in that direction, changing constantly. So how in the world can we get the results we're looking for? Well, let's change now to what it looks like if we actually did align our resources correctly towards the outcomes we want and then pruned back those areas that weren't producing those outcomes. We get something very different. And of course you see this apple tree in front of you now. Notice the lack of limbs and leaves. There's a much greater ratio between apples and limbs and leaves than there was in the previous picture. Why is that important? In times of change, it's so critical that we align every resource possible with producing the outcome we want from the change. And anything we add or anything we don't take away that's not connected to the outcome is in danger of pulling resources away from producing the quality results that we're looking for, just as this apple tree shows. While we're on the subject of apples, just a question for many of you to think about, and I think I already know the answer, but I want you to think about how many of you are on your desk right now, perhaps you're even watching this webinar on a device made by the Apple Corporation, made by Apple. I want you to think about how many of you have an iPod, an iPad, a MacBook, you name it, iPhone, a product made by the Apple Corporation. Interestingly enough, part of the success for that device that you hold in your hand or have in your work area right now is due to this idea of pruning and understanding the need to focus on limited outcomes instead of just trying to chase 20 or 30 different outcomes. In the book, Steve Jobs, written by Walter Isaacson, two fascinating quotes that come from the book that talk about the life of Steve Jobs and how and something that he projected into Apple as they went through their early years. The first quote there, his job had been to prune the apple trees so they would stay strong. And that became a metaphor for his pruning at Apple. Continuing on later on in that same area, Jobs insisted that Apple focus on just 2 or 3 priorities at a time. If you'll notice, several times throughout this webinar, I've mentioned that word priorities. Steve Jobs knew it was critical for Apple to be successful that it had to focus on just 2 or 3 priorities at a time. In step 1, or the first word we talked about, planting, I said, how will this see sunlight? How will this see the light of day? How will you make it a priority? And we talked about cultivate, and we talked about what priorities will have to shift so that this can become successful. This change can become successful. Now here we are talking about pruning, and we're still again talking about the need to prioritize where our time and energy needs to be spent to get those outcomes. change is not easy, and please understand, I hope none of you are getting that from this webinar, that the process of change, regardless of what process we use, is never easy because we're asking people to engage in new attitudes, new skills. We're trying to make changes sometimes to large-scale organizations, and it's very difficult, but we have to keep our focus on what is the outcome we're looking for. What's the priority that we want to have, first as we move through this change initiative. And as we talk about pruning, then of course we're talking about this on two levels. There are things the individual will need to do differently to be successful with this change initiative, and there are things that will need to happen within the organization to make this change successful. And so breaking it down like that is critical. We can always start with the organization, but then we have to remember the organization is not a machine. It's not just like we can flip a switch or turn a wrench. That's that mechanics mentality. But we're working with a living, breathing, growing, dynamic entity made up of people. And so how do we grow people in this process? We help them to prune away or to cut back on those areas that aren't helping them be as successful as they were. One of the areas that I find most often when working with individuals in this time of pruning is that they have to get over their perfectionist tendencies, their paralysis because things have to be perfect. One of the things that happens in times of change is that we have to allow failure. We have to allow people to know, hey, you're going to do the best with what you know. We'll learn from that, and then we'll move to something better. Going back to, I mentioned the Apple Corporation a few moments ago. If we went all the way back to 2001 when Apple introduced the iPod, we would say that revolutionized the way we listen to music, and that's true. We also have to remember that they went through 24 different versions of the iPod, sizes, shapes, 24 different versions in the years between 2001 and 2005 when they had reached the point of 70% of the market share. So it took a while, and certainly there were some mistakes, there were some units that weren't as successful as others, but it took that. So for individuals sometimes it's just getting away from that idea they have to be perfect with everything they're doing. Sometimes done is better than perfect. Let's get the data from what we just did and let's apply that to our next process or our next situation. Our last word, obviously one that we want to get from the change, is this idea of harvest. It's the idea that we want to succeed with this change, and what does that mean for us in the organization? And obviously we think, well, Jones, the outcome is my harvest, and that's true. That's our big harvest. But what about that accumulation of productive results? In times of change, we often forget that from the time of introduction of the change to the harvest, if you will, the outcome of the change, that can be 3 months, it can be 6 months, it can be a year or more for organizations. And keeping people motivated in that gap, if you will, between plant and harvest is not easy. Certainly at the beginning of a change initiative, there's lots of energy and enthusiasm. There may be a kickoff. They may even bring in a speaker like me to talk about some of the key ideas around change. And everybody's excited about the change. They leave that planting phase, and they're going out now and they're cultivating, they're pruning, they're doing all the things that happen in that midpoint of change. And it's hard. It's difficult. And if we're not careful, people can lose that motivation to stay focused on the change at the moment, and they'll want to go back to what they did before. So how do we improve that motivation and keep them to stay motivated during the change process, especially until they start seeing that it's working, which you notice the curve begins to move up. Why? Because people say, hey, all this hard work is beginning to pay off. We do that with what are called, very simply, harvest moments, taking a moment to celebrate where we've progressed. And no matter how small they are, that's critical to do in times of change, because if we don't, then people can lose the motivation to try to accomplish anything at all. So, for example, if your goal is to increase revenue by 10% in the next 12 months, we would never want to celebrate when we hit just 12. When we first see people beginning to act differently, work differently, when we start seeing that 1% increase, then that's a reason to celebrate, and that ought to be communicated out. It ought to be shared on a one-on-one level so that people can say, hey, it is working, and yes, it's not easy, but it is moving us forward. It's extremely important because our goal is that the motivation be improved during that whole process, and we not see that gap or the motivation fall during that gap. Because if we do, it means extra work we have to do to try to keep people motivated to stay on course for this change. So with those 4 words, plant, cultivate, prune, and harvest, we give people first of all, a simple language to talk about change and the change process. Secondly, we give them a universal language that can be applied wherever they are. I remember last year when I was in Saudi Arabia working with Saudi Aramco, and we didn't use apples or tomatoes, as you see on your screen right now. We used palm dates to talk about, because the same 4 things apply, plant, cultivate, prune, and harvest, apply to palms and palm dates as they do to apples or tomatoes or anything else. So you give them a universal language to focus on how to successfully change something within the organization or as an individual. So with that, Mr. Jaffrey, then I think we have reached the point where we are ready for some questions or other elements at this point.
Okay. Thank you very much, John, for a very interesting presentation. Folks, we are now open for Q&A. If you have any questions, please put it in the question box, or you please feel free to raise your hand. There's a hand icon available on the webinar console. If you click on it, I will be able to give you an opportunity to speaker directly. So, any questions? So far, question box is empty, Jones, right now. People will take a little time to write up, but please feel free to raise your hand if you have any question. Okay, we have a question caller with raised her hand, so let me go straight. We have a regular caller also, Dr. Muhammad Farid. Sir, could you please introduce and ask the question?
Hi, John. Thank you very much for your wonderful presentation. I'm one of the professors here in the university here in Riyadh, Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. My quick question is that when the organizations are doing pretty good, and that time it seems that the top management is not thinking more on changes, and they think that they are making profits, they are whatever the expectations is there of the stakeholder, they're meeting them, as well as when the chips are down and the organizations are not doing good. And it's a time when the top management thinks of seeing what the trend is, what the competitors are doing, and they try to change. And that time, unfortunately, the resources are not so much for the organization. The budgets are tight, and at that time, they are not fixed. So what is you've been so experienced being in so many organizations, being consultant. So what time is the right time for the top management to identify they should go for a change?
Right, thank you. Fantastic question. First, the first response there is that research has shown us that the best time for organizations, as you highlight, to change is when there are resources. I mean, let's go back to this gardening mentality that if a change is going to require resources, the best time to change is when resources are available. So it is in those periods when things are going well. And thinking about this gardening mentality too is that, remember, this is a constant process. It's something that has to be built and grown into the culture of the organization, is that we should always be looking. Even after a good year, we need to be looking at how can we, improve some facet of the organization, whether it's efficiency, effectiveness, market share, but it's always looking. I mean, that goes back to, there's a lot, if you go back and look at a lot of the organizations that are successful, they're constantly doing that. Let me give you 3 questions that I think are critical, that can be used to kind of unsettle those leaders, but at the same time cause them to go, wow, we do need to be looking at change even if things are good. And so these three questions, very simply, and I use these at the beginning when I'm working with any organization as it relates to change. First question is, what do we know? What are the facts? What are the statistics about our organization right now that we need to review or we need to look at? And so that's very obvious what those might be. The second question is, what do we think we know? You know, you've got, in an organization, you've got leaders with years and years of experience. They're out there watching. Some of them are watching the competition, some aren't. And so you have them in a room together and you're asking this question, what do you think you know? And somebody, you know, might say, well, I think, you know, our main competitor is going to open another line this year, or I think our major competitor is going to reach out into another country or come into our territory, or, you know, I think we're going to have a lot more people retiring this year than we did last year because they're reaching a certain age. And so it's not factual, but it's information that's a little unsettling now, because somebody sitting across the room is going, wow, I hadn't thought about that. I hadn't been looking at that. And so it kind of gets some conversation started that maybe we're not as okay just sitting still as we thought we were. So the first question is, what do you know? The second is, what do we think we know? You can use you or we, however. The last question is, what do we not know? What are the unknowns for our organization this year? And if the first two questions didn't get their attention, the third one certainly will, because now they will have to stop and go, well, I hadn't thought about that. So then they go, well, you know, I don't know if we're going to be able to make, you know, a 5% increase in production this year. I don't know if we're going to be able to expand by X%. And so it unsettles the group even more, to the point where they go, yeah, we probably need to look at changing some things. And especially if these three questions are used at a time when things are going, you know, well, or even moderately well, you have the opportunity to grow changes in an environment where it's not this sense of succeed or die kind of mentality. And people don't like working under those types of environments. It's more difficult sometimes to get them to move when things are going well, because they're going, well, why should we be doing things differently? But asking those three questions, I think, is the beginning to kind of get people moving toward change.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Muhammad, for asking the question and always keeping the webinar sessions exciting.
No, in fact, it's a pleasure. Thanks, Jonathan. Thanks, Ali, for giving me the opportunity. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Let me move to another question from Mr. Daniel O'Connor. Question is, I would welcome hearing examples of this process being implemented, perhaps expanding on the Saudi Aramco example.
Okay, tell me the last part of that quote, expanding around what, Mr. Jaffrey? I couldn't quite understand that.
Perhaps expanding on the Saudi Aramco example that you mentioned briefly.
Sure. Saudi Aramco was a very short time there, and so I really didn't get the opportunity to really look at building that organization. I was speaking at a change management forum that they held, and so I had an hour on the program, almost to do what we did today, just to introduce the concept and for individuals to begin looking at where they might implement it within their own department within Saudi Aramco. So I didn't get the opportunity there. Where I have begun to see opportunities is in healthcare. We see healthcare organizations, certainly here in the U.S., that are looking to improve, and of course the big thing is we can't disrupt the daily operations within healthcare any more than we have to, because people's lives are at stake. And so building this gardening mindset causes individuals in the organization. For example, I did some work with Harbor UCLA Medical Center with their safety patient safety, I'll get it out in a minute, patient safety, and they began to implement some of these strategies. And for example, one doctor I talked to said, you know, Jones, after your presentation, I began to see that instead of telling my people to do 4 things differently, I need to do one thing, have them start doing one thing differently, get that ingrained within their normal workday. Remember the process part of cultivating change. And then once we've got that one developed as a habit, now let's do another one. Because if we tried to implement all 4, first of all, remember the phrase I think Peter Drucker uses is that what gets measured gets managed. It's hard to measure a lot of different things if we're asking our employees to do that. But if we're just looking at one, it's easy to measure that, or maybe 2. So that's one of the places where we've seen organizations embrace this mindset and begin to take a more proactive stance towards change.
Hey, well, thank you very much. Another question from Antonio. Can you suggest some tips on how to transform managers into gardeners and engage them with the change?
Yeah, I'd love to hear more about that question offline, because I get that one frequently, because managers sometimes are seen as the ones who are kind of the gatekeepers. You know, the people, we've got people who are frontline making changes, we've got people at the executive level who are sharing the changes with management, and if they're not the ones promoting those, then that's where sometimes the change wilts and dies, to use our gardening mentality. In answer to the question, I think one of the most important ways is we have to show those managers what the outcome is, what's the harvest we're after, having a clear, identifiable outcome of what this change is going to bring. And if we can have those managers sign off on, wow, yes, I want that for the organization, I want that for myself, then it's easier to move backwards then and say, okay, how are you going to need to work with your people differently? How are you going to manage yourself differently each day? And I think that's the stepping off point, is having that clear, identifiable, shared sense of outcome for the change. And then secondly, it comes back to this sense of urgency. I can't tell you how many organizations that I've worked with over the years that when I ask that question, what's the sense of urgency for your people to change, I don't get a convincing answer. In fact, a lot of times I don't even get an answer. Well, I hadn't thought about that. We just want them to do this. Well, holding the idea of a job or not having a job is one way to get people to have a sense of urgency. But what are you appealing to? And one of the articles that's on my website, on the Mile page that I alluded to earlier, joneslaughlin.com/mile, I have 8 questions there to ask before asking others to change. And one of them is, what's their currency? What's important to that individual that you are going to work with to try to get them to change attitudes and change behaviors? And when we say management is not responding to change, or they're not being proactive about change, it's not looking at them universally, but looking at almost every one of those managers individually and say, what's their currency? For one, it might be recognition. For one, it might be a sense of accomplishment. For another one, it may be a monetary type incentive. And of course, we can't necessarily have individual improvement plans for every manager to change, but looking at it very specifically versus just casting it out there saying, hey, we want you to change so the organization can grow, that's too vague and too nebulous. So those are some of my initial suggestions for helping management to develop more of a gardening mentality.
Well, thank you very much. And one last question from your experience. What is the biggest obstacle to have change efficiently implemented?
Okay, read that one again to me.
From your experience, what is the biggest obstacle to have change implemented efficiently?
Sure. Biggest obstacle to having change implemented efficiently is we fail to identify how we want people to work differently on a daily basis. How are they going to break down their time differently? How are they going to where are they going to spend their time? If before they were spending 40% of their time, 40% of their time here, and 20% there, what's going to change about that? Do you want them to spend 15 more minutes on this, or do you want them to spend an hour more looking at this differently? But implementing change efficiently, the first thing is, what do we want people to do differently on a daily basis? One of the biggest resistors to change is that people don't immediately understand how they're going to be asked to do some things differently. And if we can clearly help them see what needs to be done differently on a daily basis, then people can see, okay, this is manageable. Because remember, we're gardening now. We're not going to take the big wrench out and make one huge change. We're gardening. Here's what I'm going to ask you to cultivate differently. Here's where I'm going to ask you to cut back a little bit so you can apply resources here. And then we talk about efficiently. It's celebrating those harvest moments. It's taking the opportunity to celebrate with that employee or that individual when they do take this new step. Say, wow, see, we did that. Excellent. Now, how do we continue that process? So I think those are the keys to implementing change efficiently within an organization.
Well, thank you very much, Jones. This really brings us towards the end of the webinar. I would like to thank you on behalf of Mal for giving this excellent presentation today and for your time. Any concluding remarks that you would like to give before we dismiss out, sir?
So thankful for the opportunity to interact with all of you today. I know I've thrown out a lot of information to you. The resources on the screen are some other opportunities for you to connect with me outside of the webinar. I especially would encourage you to go to joneslaughlin.com/mile. We actually have a summary of the webinar. We also have those articles that are there and some other information that will help you begin to grow out even more of what we've planted today about these 4 words of successful change.
Okay, once again, thank you very much, Jones, and thank you all of those who participated in this webinar. We are recording it. It will be uploaded, accessible to all of you on Mile Community in the next couple of days. However, I have sent you a link from where you can download the software.
Madinah Institute for Leadership and Entrepreneurship, MILE.